Good evening. Welcome to the April 19th, 2022 edition of the Downers Grove Village Council meeting. We're glad you're here with us tonight. As is our custom, we'll begin the meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Rosa, would you please call the roll?
Mayor Barnett,
Here.
Commissioner Jose,
Here.
Commissioner Wallace,
Here.
Commissioner Sadowski-Fugit,
Here.
Commissioner Colavani,
Here.
Commissioner Gilmartin,
Here.
Commissioner Glover.
Here.
Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Mayor.
We have Commissioner Gilmartin remote tonight, so is there a motion concerning electronic participation?
Mayor, I move to allow electronic participation for the April 19th, 2022 Village Council meeting.
Second.
Any discussion from the council? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
All right, that carries. Welcome, Chris. Item 3 on the agenda tonight, we have a couple of proclamations. So if you'll bear with me for a moment. The first is Earth Day. Whereas the first Earth Day was enacted in 1970 and engaged over 20 million Americans to advocate for a cleaner environment. And whereas humankind continues to face real global challenges affecting every community, including degradation of ecosystems and global, local climate changes. And whereas all species play a unique role in the complex web of life and contribute to the ecosystem services on which all life on Earth depends. Hence, protecting our species is crucial to the survival of this planet and its inhabitants. Whereas many plants, wild animals, and pollinators live in urbanized landscapes, and cities thereby have a responsibility to examine the ecological impacts of their actions, consider how to protect biodiversity, and focus our attention on reducing our own environmental footprint. And whereas environmental education, resource conservation, waste reduction, and environmental protections are necessary to ensure a sustainable future. And whereas it is understood that sustainability will only be achieved by meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. Whereas Earth Day is an annual reminder of the constant need for environmental activism, stewardship commitments, and sustainability efforts. And whereas every year on April 22nd, men, women, and children participate in environmental stewardship activities such as stream cleanups, planting of trees, educational events, celebrating sustainable accomplishments, and more. Now therefore, I, Robert T. Barnett, Mayor of the Village of Downers Grove, have the distinct honor of proclaiming April 22nd, 2022 as Earth Day, and I encourage all residents, businesses, and institutions to participate in programs and activities that will protect our environment and contribute to a healthy, sustainable future. Dated this 19th day of April, Downers Grove, Illinois. Related, and just as important, we have a proclamation concerning Arbor Day. Whereas in 1972, J. Sterling Morton proposed that the Nebraska Board of Agriculture set aside a special day for the planting of trees, and that first Arbor Day was observed by the planting of more than 1 million trees in Nebraska, reminding us that one person's initiative can make a lasting and meaningful difference. And whereas the last Friday in April has been designated as Arbor Day, to encourage the planting of trees, their care and protection from insects, diseases, and mistreatment that destroy their beauty and usefulness. And whereas trees improve the physical environment of our community by producing oxygen, absorbing carbon dioxide, reducing erosion of topsoil by wind and water, assisting in the mitigation of stormwater accumulation, and providing habitat for wildlife. Whereas trees add much more to our community by providing beauty, moderating temperature, reducing heating and cooling needs, increasing property values, bringing about a sense of place and well-being among the concrete and asphalt of urban America, and enhancing the economic vitality of business areas, thereby improving the quality of life for years to come. Whereas the Village of Downers Grove has received national recognition for nearly 4 decades of its tree care program by again being named Tree City USA for the community's management and care of our over 23,000 trees located in public parkways. Now therefore, I, Robert T. Barnett, Mayor of the Village of Downers Grove, do hereby proclaim Friday, April 29th to be Arbor Day in the Village of Downers Grove, and urge all residents to plant and care for their trees now and for future generations. Dated this 19th day of April, 2022 at Downers Grove, Illinois. Arbor Day and Earth Day are good annual reminders. There are always, as we know from our meetings and the various comments we get, there are always degrees of interest and degrees of investment and degrees of seriousness on every one of these subjects, but I think everybody agrees these are subjects worthy of recognition and action on a daily basis. And so it's a good reminder to our community that we approach Arbor Day and Earth Day with that same intensity and focus, and encourage everybody to take action. Item 4 on our agenda tonight, minutes of previous council meetings. Is there a motion?
Mayor, I move that the council adopt the minutes of the April 12, 2022 minutes as presented.
Second.
Any questions or comments from the council? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
That carries unanimously. Public comments portion of our meeting. This is an opportunity for the public to comment on non-agenda items. Public comments portion of these meetings, both on agenda items and non-agenda items, is an opportunity for the public to address their village council. We try to be accommodating, but please remember this is not a debate, nor is it an open question and answer session. It is simply an opportunity to speak to your council. We have a variety of additional opportunities to engage council members, including our remarks system, the CRC system, Coffee with the Council, direct mail or by phone, and every one of your council members has spent time in person off this day is making themselves available. The public comments agenda item here and the public comments portion of each specific agenda item upcoming are intentional parts of a structured meeting. As such, we do have a few expectations on how they'll be handled. Please state your name for the record. Please keep comments to 5 minutes or less. Avoid repeating what others may already have said. And please keep your comments to one visit to the podium per subject. If you forget to mention something or additional conversation brings up a new idea or thought, please hold that until after the meeting and use one of those other methods to contact us as needed or bring it to our next meeting. With that, are there any comments not related to agenda items this evening?
Hi, my name is James Kelly. Sorry. Hi, my name is James Kelly. I do have a little situation, and I've discussed it with some people in the city already, and I'm really concerned because I don't want to be a negative thorn in somebody's side, and I do love Downers Grove, and I do plan on spending a long time here, if not, establish myself and retiring here and buying some property. But what over the last couple of weeks, I've been dealing with a landlord that basically is a slumlord. And I tried to help him. I did work on it, his property, which I probably shouldn't have done because my people that were in the process of backing me says we were supposed to concentrate in the office, not on the black mold that was festering the walls and the beams throughout the building. Well, that was one thing. The other thing is that in the hallway, there's a stack of stuff in the common area of the hallway that's almost as tall as me. It's blocking my access from the common door that's in the middle of the building. It's a fire hazard. There's numerous other things in the building that need to be looked at. I nicely suggested to your building department when I showed them that the pictures of what I found after I pulled the shower stall off, and I said, you guys really need to inspect the building. So thankfully, I got a real compliment from it. I was told that if I want the building inspected, I have to apply for compliance, the application to occupy the building. Well, applying for application to occupy the building, there's a catch-22. I can't get the landlord to sign it because the landlord's not truly happy that I found all this stuff wrong with his building. It's an ongoing fire hazard right now. And my concern is I can leave. I already found 2 other offices that I got a great deal on. Nice, beautiful offices. Nothing wrong with them. I could leave, but you know what? I got a responsibility. And if I'm going to be part of this city, this village, then I got the responsibility to not just come here and play nicey-nicey and compliment people for their wonderful attitude. I also have a responsibility to call it out and say, hey, I got a letter saying that if I don't sign this application after I gave my email, my attorney's email, that I possibly would get a ticket for so many dollars a day. Well, I can't apply for it unless the landlord signs it. The landlord's trying to evict me after I found out so much sort of stuff wrong with his building, and he's telling me to cut my losses. Well, that has nothing to do with your city council. I'm a big boy, I can handle it, I have attorneys. But what does have to do with your city council and your city or your village is blight and safety. And I have to think it's an oxymoron thing when I go to the building department and I show some photographs of mold that's been active and decaying 2x6s, and I'm told by the building department, did you get permission to tear that down? It's like, really? That's kind of an oxymoron statement. And I hope I don't get, backlash for doing this, but enough is enough. If I don't speak up and step up to the plate and take the responsibility for me and what I stand for, then I'm no better than my landlord. The address is 5312 Main Street. It's been suggested to walk away. You don't need the headaches. You don't need to stretch. You don't need your anxiety built up. Well, it's not a matter of just walking away. I had a $20,000, $50,000 potential investor that came to the building on a Saturday when some stuff was moved, and he says, leave. I'll talk to you after you leave. But leaving isn't going to solve the problem. There's an older lady on the other side of my office, the other side of the common area. She's having all kinds of health issues, and it's probably been worse since she moved into the building. And it's a fire hazard. There's been, I stopped by there, I don't sleep all the time, I stopped by there just to check on it, turn on the lights and whatever. I caught some guy in the hallway in the winter smoking a cigarette, trying to stay warm. The same place now, if he goes in there and smokes a cigarette, he's going to basically be next to a fire hazard. And I have found cigarettes in my office. I don't smoke. And when anybody's with me, they don't smoke. And my office was left open. And it's sad. On a positive note, I see your social workers working hard with the homeless situation. Unfortunately, or fortunately, you have a homeless situation that basically, because you're such a wonderful, kind town, you have people coming from the city, deep in the west side of Chicago, from far south side of Montgomery, with issues that need to be addressed. So it's not just Donner Grove residents. I'm not saying you shouldn't allow anybody here. Everybody's welcome to a city. Nobody should be told they can't be here. But it's become, but you have addressed it. Your social worker has been out there. DuPage County PADS has turned up the volume. I see their outreach person more and more on the street. Unfortunately, the guy that were in the outreach before, he quit because he said it was too dangerous. Have a nice evening.
Thanks, Jim. Others on subjects not on tonight's agenda?
David Rove. Understood properly, environmental sustainability means living within limits, that is, consuming resources at a rate less than the sustainable rate at which they're available. I've said to council before that empires begin to fail when they reach their limit of sustainability and their elites refuse either to recognize that reality or to give up their power and way of life. Either way, the burden of hitting limits is foisted onto non-elites, starting with the poorest and least powerful. By both action and inaction, council has shown Americans and their leaders are not ready to take seriously the goal of living environmentally sustainably, which is to say we support the U.S. and other rich nations marauding the planet so we can maintain our unsustainable way and standard of living. It's that arrangement Russia now resists with force in Ukraine. Current CIA Director William Burns started warning U.S. leaders in 1995 when he served as a diplomat in Moscow that Ukraine and NATO was a red line they should not cross. His 2008 memo to Secretary of State Rice predicted what we see before us now should NATO refuse to heed the warning that Vladimir Putin himself gave European and U.S. leaders in 2007. Putin warned them at a security conference in Munich to stop pursuing the unipolar world order, one of the euphemistic phrases used then and now to avoid calling it the U.S. imperialist order. They never listened, so here we are. This is just part of the background that must be kept hidden in order to persuade the rich nation's citizens our side is morally justified, A, supporting Ukraine with arms and aid, and B, refusing to negotiate with Russia over its concerns. What we see instead is an unprecedented marketing effort, propaganda, psyops, to use the military term, to cast Russia and Putin specifically as the devil incarnate, not rational actors, but culturally, indeed genetically evil. The problem, of course, such an arrangement is recognizably hypocritical were one to compare U.S. war-making and other nefarious deeds around the world in recent decades to Russia's. Seeing the effects of war in Ukraine shocks Americans because media coverage of U.S. war-making was missing or sanitized during that time. How many Americans know, for example, that since just 2001, U.S. and its allies have dropped over 300,000 bombs on various peoples and places? Americans and Europeans oppose Russia's military operation in Ukraine down to the last Ukrainian, but caution Russia not to attack 1 inch of NATO territory or else. The obvious danger to us all, fighting spreads into a full-blown worldwide military conflict complete with exchange of nuclear bombs. That would almost certainly disrupt Council's plans for a new village office facility, among other unpleasant treats. So far, instead of a direct military response to Russia, NATO nations have levied sanctions. Obvious question, how do you sanction someone on whom you depend economically? Most notably, Europeans have yet to punish Russia by refusing to buy its natural gas or oil. By removing historical and political economic context, the PSYOPs effort frames the Ukraine conflict in one-sided terms. Putin invaded for no reason, neither the U.S. nor NATO did anything to provoke it, says President Biden. U.S. media dutifully portray Ukraine as a battle to stop evil, envious Russians from thwarting the rich nation's benevolent effort to uplift the world by spreading democratic capitalism, emphasis on democracy, not capitalism. The Russians, along with the Chinese, Indians, and much of the rest of the world, see the battle as a justifiable, indeed unavoidable attempt to stop the U.S.-led rich nation's marauding. The PSYOPs effort naturally dismisses that notion as myth/disinformation. Economist Michael Hudson, however, provides useful analysis. Major bone of contention, U.S.'s free-riding rentier atop the global economy. As Hudson explains, the U.S. pattern has been to import real goods from other nations, the fruits of their labor and or their raw materials, in exchange for not a like amount of U.S.-made source real goods, but our fiat currency, U.S. dollars. In effect, IOUs that never come due. In other words, the current neoliberal international order is a gangster-bankster arrangement, a relationship known colloquially in the U.S. as a protection racket. By ignoring this reality, the PSYOPs effort strives to sidestep the questions I posed many months ago to Council. Is capitalism compatible with environmental sustainability? Is democratic capitalism as practiced by the world's rich nations compatible? Is the U.S.-led pattern of globalization compatible? The obvious inference, if they are, why the need for marauding? Which is to say, if we in the rich nations can't prove compatibility, we cannot claim the moral high ground in the Ukraine or any other conflict. So if we really want to help stop not just the war crimes, but the crime of war, we need to start taking seriously the goal of living environmentally sustainably. And please don't imagine Council's proposed new village hall makes more than a fart's worth of difference in that regard. And let me close by saying I find it quite ironic that the mayor had the 2 proclamations this evening in light of the February decision you all made.
Anybody else? Subjects not on tonight's agenda? Okay, we'll continue with our agenda then. Is there a motion concerning consent agenda?
Mayor, I move that the council adopt the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries unanimously. Sorry, Chris, I keep cutting you off. Item 8 is our active agenda. Our active agenda is the portion of the meeting where we plan to take action on subjects previously discussed, sometimes the prior meeting, sometimes multiple meetings. Is there a motion concerning the designation of, design rather, of the construction of a sidewalk?
Mayor, I move that the council instruct staff to proceed with the final design plans for construction of a sidewalk on Blodgett Avenue from 59th Street to 61st Street as presented.
Second.
Any comments or questions on this item from the audience? Comments or questions from the council? Okay, just a reminder for those watching home, this is second round, I think, of a little longer-term project where we're enhancing the sidewalks to try and improve walkability and safety near many District 58 schools. I don't remember what the total list included. This is round 2. I think there's somewhere around 6 to 8 or so. So this is a continuation of that effort. And two things. One, the policy portion of that has largely been discussed. And when you start putting sidewalks in, there's usually not a lot of choices. And so that's why maybe not so much discussion tonight on the subject. All right, Rose, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Wallace?
Aye.
Commissioner Glover?
Aye.
Commissioner Gilmartin?
Aye.
Commissioner Kolovany?
Aye.
Commissioner Sadowski Fugit?
Aye.
Mayor Barnett?
Aye, that motion passes unanimously. Is there a motion concerning an ordinance amending the village budget?
Mayor, I move that the council adopt an ordinance providing for an amendment to ordinance number 5831 and the Village of Downers Grove budget for fiscal year 2021 as presented.
Second.
Any comments or questions from the audience on this item? Comments or questions from the council? Anybody watching at home that might be watching for the first time, I would encourage you to go back and look at the last couple of meetings. There is a pretty extensive both discussion on this day as presentation for our staff as well as details. This is really a housekeeping matter, frankly, as a function of a little better year than we planned. Rosa, please call the roll.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Wallace?
Aye.
Commissioner Glover?
Aye.
Commissioner Gilmartin?
Aye.
Commissioner Kolovany?
Aye.
Commissioner Sadowski Fugit?
Aye.
Mayor Barnett?
Aye, that too passes unanimously. That ends our active agenda. Item 9 would be our first reading. We do not have any first reading items tonight, so we'll move to item 10, the manager's report.
Thank you, Mayor. There are 2 items on tonight's manager's report. In between the first and second item, we'll take a 5-minute break to reset up the room, and I'll hand the reins over to Mr. Baker for item B. Item A is a motion approving the scope of the social services gap analysis report. So really tonight we're seeking direction from the council on what the scope of this report should be. My presentation tonight will include all the topics shown here on the screen, ranging from the goal of the social services referral program that is now in operation, how this program came about, and the proposed scope of the gap analysis report and the next steps as we go along this journey. Earlier this year, the village launched the Social Services Referral Program. The goal of the program is to connect individuals in need of services with the agencies that provide these services. In doing so, the village seeks to increase awareness of the services and to increase access to the services. In the first few months of its existence, this program has been an overwhelming success. The referral program itself is the product of the Village Council direction and recommendations made by the Human Service Ad Hoc Committee. The council created the Ad Hoc Committee a few years ago and asked them to make recommendations about the village's role in social services. The top recommendation was to create a social services referral program, and in late 2020, the Village Council approved an action plan. That plan called for the engagement of professional staff, which we now have, as the social worker mentioned earlier tonight by Mr. Kelly. The relaunching of the Human Service Commission, which has been done and now meeting on a regular basis, and the development of a social services referral program, which I just mentioned. All these actions have taken place, and you see just one check mark left on our action plan. That last action item is to identify gaps in service provision and to create strategies to address those gaps. So we are just now starting this project with the staff and the Human Service Commission. And we need some council direction on the scope of this project. The proposed scope starts with a proposed definition of what is a service gap. Staff is proposing that a service gap, or definition of gap, is the inability of the village to successfully refer a resident to a social service agency which provides the requested service. That's the proposed definition of a gap. And therefore, as proposed, a service gap would exist in the following three situations. First, when a resident is not aware of the availability of a social service provider or of the village's referral service. Commonly referred to now as an awareness gap. Second, a gap would exist when a resident does not accept a referral provided by the village. This would be an acceptance gap. And finally, a gap would exist when the village is unable to identify and contact an agency that provides the requested service, a service or availability gap. Those are the key components of the scope. With those definitions of gap and conditions under which it exists, we would then go about identifying and quantifying gaps in social service as determined through the operation of the referral program. We're tracking data on a monthly basis that would help us determine if any of those three gaps exist or not, and if they do, the extent to which they do. And then recommend strategies to address identified gaps. So tonight we're looking for council concurrence and direction on the scope. Once we get that scope, we will present the scope to the Human Service Commission as soon as a week from tonight. And then in this remainder of the spring and summer, we would work with the Human Service Commission to draft that report with recommendations and bring it back to this council for implementation. So with that, we are looking for council direction on the proposed scope, Mayor.
Thank you, Dave. It's just a discussionary period for our team here. Anybody want to start the conversation? Leslie, please.
Yes, one area that, first, this is great, and I'm very excited that this is happening, but one area that I would consider a gap to be if a resident is not able to access due to kind of systemic capacity issues. So I'm sure that's going to be even more exaggerated now with COVID-19, especially with regard to mental health providers. But even just in my own personal experience, knowing that I have a neurodiverse child and we have seen a pediatric neurologist, and I have friends who do the same, and that can be a year-plus long waiting list because there are so few providers that it can be really challenging to get in. And that can really provide difficulties for someone who is struggling if they have that long of a wait list, if they don't have the resources that we are lucky enough to have. So it almost seems like almost part of that third bullet, where I don't know if there's a way we could tweak it or make it more specific, but I do think that one gap would be, again, systemic capacity issues, where we know there might just be a real lack of providers in the area and they can't keep up with demand. So just something that I thought of.
Any comments on the other components?
The other components look great. Yeah.
Anyone else comments on this? Staff's looking for direction from us. Nicole?
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate this what I believe is incredibly thorough, although Commissioner Sadowski-Fugit brings up a good point. And I actually have parents that consistently complain that they are on these huge, long waiting lists, and they really struggle finding people that can service their child right now. And that goes for adults as well, just being able to find a provider that is available due to the environment and everything that is going on right now. I think a lot of people are overloaded. And so I've been, when you said that, I've been sitting here trying to think how to reword that to include that, but I wouldn't mind trying to make that, include that in there, because I do think it's valid. But I appreciate staff's work on this so much, and I think this is awesome and very thorough, but if we could find a way to kind of sneak something in there, I think that's important. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg, please.
Thank you, Mayor. I also appreciate the report, and I think you've done a very nice job encapsulating what it is we're really driving at. The three service gaps that are proposed, I think, make a lot of sense, as does the definition of gap itself. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that what Commissioner Sadowski-Fugit proposes is in itself a gap. I mean, it's certainly a problem. But it's worth noting as well, but I just don't know that it falls into the category of something we can do anything about, short of going into providing that service itself. And I'm not sure that we're ready for that conversation. I think we're several steps before that. So I think the service gaps that we have proposed make a lot of sense to me. If we want to track when there's super long lists, I mean, I'm fine with that, but I wonder what the next step is. What's the utility of that information? Thank you, Mayor.
Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, realistically, for bullet point 2, we can't do anything if a resident doesn't accept a referral. I mean, that is, it's a gap, but it's also something that we can't necessarily do something about. But I think it is worthwhile, you know, if we are trying to refer folks to certain services, it's important for us to know if there is a gap with regard to, you know, those long waiting lists and people not being able to access it and potentially dropping off and not being able to access care. Similar to not accepting a referral, I don't know what that next step is of what we could do about it, but I do think that it's important that we kind of keep track of that to know where those gaps are in those services in our communities, to see if perhaps there are other, you know, nonprofits or anyone else that we might want to, you know, partner with or work with going forward to try and drive some of those services to the area. So I'm comfortable with, you know, moving forward. I still think it's a gap. We might not be able to do anything about it, but it's worthwhile to track and see if there are those areas that people aren't getting the services that they need.
Rich?
So the potential wording at the end of post 3 provides the requested service within a reasonable period of time.
Yep, that would work.
And then regarding number 1, the resident is not aware of the availability of the social services provided by the village referral service. We have a general problem in this town of people being surprised by things, like major developments going in, and even though some of the things have been in the works for months, and in some cases in the village, in the works for years, like with our facility, and they still act surprised when it comes up. So I'm not sure how much of that, we can identify it, I'm not sure how much we're going to solve it, what else we could do.
I'm going to pick up on that a little bit. So I'm going to start at the beginning with this gap of the inability of the village to successfully refer a resident to a social agency which provides the service. My recollection of how we got here, that really would have maybe been better said, which can provide the requested service. And I don't know what we intended with what's, which provides, you know, is in the business of providing, or which actually accomplishes the provision. Those are two very different things. I understood this to really be an agency which can provide the requested service. So with that as a starting point, then when we get down, at least in my head, when we get down to service gap exists, the first bullet is, I think, from my vantage point, why we have the program that we have in place. I think we should assume that when you look at the scope of village demographics, 50,000 people with a real cross-section, and all of the potential service providers, I think there's got to be a huge number of instances where that's the norm, right? Any one of us up here probably can't name more than 20, and there's 500 of them. So the idea that there's a lack of awareness, I think, is why, in my mind, why we have the social worker and have tasked that position as we have. So I think that that's the definition of a gap. I think that's sort of what we know. That's the known condition. It's not, to Greg's point, we wouldn't do anything. The answer to doing something about that is hiring somebody who will help make those connections. And I feel the same way for the second point there. A resident doesn't accept. That by definition means a resident has either sought help or been identified as needing help and been contacted, been in touch with us, gone through the process of being made aware, and then chosen not to take some action. Now, there's there's 50,000 reasons why somebody might not do that. But it no longer, in my mind, going back to the beginning of the process and why we hired that position and why we're continuing this path, in my mind, is no longer a gap. Person has made an individual choice, which there's 50,000 reasons to do, to either take or not take help. It's that third one, plus, I think to Leslie's point, if you know that somebody's out there, let's take it at public safety, right? If we knew we had a police force, but nobody could show up for 2 hours, we would consider a pretty serious gap in service there, right? So that, I think, is part of what we want to understand, is where those places, where people are not able to get service. I think that's different than accepting it or being made aware of it. So from my perspective, I think that third bullet point adjusted in a way, sort of as Rich said, to kind of meet Leslie's definition, makes sense to me. I don't feel like the first two are part of the gap definition that I'm feeling like we're trying to identify. Just additional thoughts from the way I see it. Anyone else?
Mayor, if I could?
Yeah, please, Chris.
Thank you. And I did have a little trouble hearing you, so forgive me if I'm repeating anything. But first, I want to say I appreciate the continued work on this. I do think these three metrics are important. I also agree with Commissioner Zadowski about that metric of overcapacity or looking at capacity. I think from what I think I'm hearing, and forgive me, that technology has been a little in and out, it sounds like we are, maybe some of us are questioning about whether or not what we can do with that. If someone doesn't accept the service, then our work is done there. And while I feel from an operational standpoint that might be correct, I think these data points are still important for us to know, because in that example of someone not accepting, if we're seeing a pattern of not accepting on a certain service or a certain area, that might be an indication that maybe we haven't connected with the right solution or haven't described it in the right way. So while I understand that our job isn't to figure out exactly how everyone is making decisions, I do think tracking these things can lead to insights that we may not just be on the surface. So I do support Commissioner Zadowski's addition of that capacity gap, if you will, because I think that is a real challenge, and it may lead us down paths that we weren't thinking about, ways that we can add more connections or provide more. But all of this that's been presented, I think, is worthy of measuring and taking a look at, and I would be very interested to see where these metrics fall 6 months, 12 months from now. Thank you, Mayor.
Dave, aren't we measuring, 1 and 2, we're, as a function of operating, we're collecting that data, right?
We're collecting data on, well, 1 is interesting, right? Because it's hard to measure the people who are not aware of what you're trying to measure. So we'll never really get a quantitative, how many people don't know about us kind of a data point. But we're always looking for ways to increase awareness of the existence of our program. The second and third ones we measure on a monthly basis, absolutely.
Yeah, I would think every contact would feed that database.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I would think as our first responders respond to calls, that's probably where a lot of our input comes from. As they engage with the people in a call and they recognize a problem, and then, those individuals or that family say, oh, I had no idea you had this referral program. So those are going to have to surface organically as they come up. And then as far as capacity, even if 1% of our population hit us at one time, that's 490 to 500 people or instances. And that social worker could get very busy very quickly. So I think we're going to have to see how this thing rolls out in the next few months. But generally, I'm in agreement with the scope. I think you're right on track with.
I think the important thing to remember as we're kicking this around and trying to give direction to the team over there is that what we're trying to do is narrow down the scope of report. I think, Greg, to your point about what we do with the information, I don't think any of us knows or is predetermining that, right? There's a what do we want it back? You know, the question really is, what do the 7 of us want back in terms of information? And that's, in that context, you know, we're probably already doing half of this stuff, and so if we add some scope, that doesn't seem out of line to me. The rubber hits the road. The real challenges are when we get some gaps, whether they're consistent, you know, denials or rejections of service, or big holes in there, what to do with that information. But that's a discussion for a future day. Anybody want to add to this?
Need a motion on that?
Mayor, if I could.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, I'm also on a delay, so I'm realizing you're not hearing me right away. I just want to ask, tonight for this motion, we're just discussing whether these are the metrics we want to hear back. We're not necessarily, or hear back on, we're not necessarily discussing how these should be measured correctly. And maybe a question for you, Dave, is it the Human Services Committee's role to determine how they might measure this, or are you going to make recommendations on how we would do that? How do you think that might work?
So we think we have a really good handle on the data collection and data measurement and metrics reporting. What we're trying to figure out is, when the council directed us to prepare a report that identifies gaps and strategies to address them, we just want to make sure that we have an idea of what does the council think a service gap is.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And what I'm hearing so far then is a quick change to the bullet point number 3. The village is unable to identify and contact an agency that provides the requested service and can provide said service in a timely manner. Perhaps that would be the basis for the motion?
Leslie, does that fit your...
Yes. Yep, absolutely.
Chris, do you hear that?
I did, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. That worked. Reach it.
Greg?
In that case, Mayor, I move to approve the scope of the social services gap analysis report as discussed tonight.
Second.
Any additional comments, questions from the council? Comments or questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have a comment. Tonight, I talked to...
Hey, Jim, seriously, wait till you get there.
Tonight, I talked to one of your residents, and she said actually she's going to come to the next city council meeting. She said I can't give her name out because she wants to do it herself. I've been talking to her for about 2 months. She has an individual that lives in the town. She's concerned, and part of what you're talking about right now is she's been trying to help this individual, which is one of her kids, for a couple of years. He has some issues, some serious issues that go up and down. When she basically talks to some of these agencies, DuPage County Pets or some other ones, they're overloaded, get back to us, do this, do that, and you run into dead ends. So if you're doing this stuff that you have here, you might want to think about maybe going after some other agencies that are outside of the DuPage County areas. There's clinics, Wandale Clinic, because within the last 3 years, the mental health conditions of the society, human race, has just gotten really bad. We're no different here than any other town, but just to give a referral, and if the referral you're giving is to dead ears, no resources, I've got people come to me and say they got a referral for this, not through your social work service worker. She's been working really hard the last couple of weeks, but through other agencies around here. A list of stuff, you call them up, and there's no help. So if you're going to actually get involved, check and balance. I mean, I had a discussion with Greg about that a couple of months ago about DuPage County Pets. So you basically, if you're going to work a program like this, you're going to have to check and balance who you're referring to. Otherwise, you're wasting your time and energy.
Thank you.
I've not been a fan of this, as you know from my prior comments. This gets into the data that I think you've not had, but you've put the cart before the horse, hired someone on the premise that you think you have a need, and it sounds good because you're doing all these wonderful things. But I have to say, this conversation strikes me as an example of the fact that you aren't really sure what it is you're trying to accomplish. And when you talk about a gap, to me, given the scope of what I can imagine would be envisioned, both from the average person's perspective, but also from the conversation I've heard at the meetings, that services is virtually unlimited by definition. So therefore, whatever you're going to measure is unlimited by definition. And it strikes me that one of the things that you need to do is be a little bit clearer on what it is you're trying to accomplish. In that regard, I'll also say that if this program is intended to be a referral service, I don't know how you define gaps in referrals. I don't find very helpful the 3 metrics that were put up there. Can you put them back up there? No?
If directed by the council, I'll put them back up.
The metrics indicate that a person who refuses to accept a referral, that's defined as a gap. I don't see how that's perceived as a gap. You made the referral, you succeeded in connecting the person to the service. That's a win, that's not a gap. That may be a gap in filling a need, but that's not what you're trying to do. All you're trying to do are make referrals. But good luck. Thanks, Dave.
Any other questions or comments from the audience? Before we vote on this, any other comments or questions from the council? For those watching at home, we'll just summarize. If you've been paying attention to this process since the beginning, you'll recognize that the reason we started down this path is twofold. One, we had a group of residents who were charged with considering the conditions of social service. Of course, that's a broad definition, but conditions of social service within our community. We got some input from them, and we had a lot of very real-life, day in and day out information from primarily our public safety teams, but also other village staff, that there were in fact challenges with people finding the help they need. So in an attempt to address that, we thought the best way to do so was with a concierge, so to speak. A pretty natural next step in that process is trying to understand whether we're covering all the bases. And so it's that simple. That's what we're trying to do here, is figure out whether or not we're covering all the bases. Then we can decide what to do if in fact we're not. If we are, we can feel good about that as well. But that is how we got here, and that is the data we used. And for those that might be wondering what we're trying to accomplish, it's helping people, connecting them to the help they need. With that, Rose, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Wallace?
Aye.
Commissioner Glover?
Aye.
Commissioner Gilmartin?
Aye.
Commissioner Colavani?
Aye.
Commissioner Sadowski-Fugit?
Aye.
Mayor Barnett?
Aye. That passed unanimously. Thank you for that, Dave.
Thank you so much. That is clear direction. We're excited to continue this work, and we'll get going on it right away with the next Human Service Commission, which is a week from tonight in the committee room. And with that, Mayor, it may be appropriate to take a quick 5-minute recess to reset the room for the next part of the manager's report.
That is what we will do. As mentioned earlier, we're going to take that 5-minute recess. We'll reconvene this meeting in this room to discuss some village facilities issues. 5 minutes. Chris, you still with us?
I am, Mayor. Thank you.
Rich and I will do our best to whisper going forward. All right, we're calling this meeting back into session to continue through the manager's report and talk about village facilities. Mr. Baker.
Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. Excited to be here this evening, along with the design team for the facility replacement and sustainability plan, to talk about two very important spaces within and around the building, the Betty Cheevers Chambers and the Blackburn Civil Rights Plaza. We're seeking council input as the design progresses on these two important areas. Thought I'd start out with some just orientation. If you look at the rendering here, this is the building design. Again, this is a combined police station, village hall, that will also accommodate the administrative offices for District 58. It is located on the west side of the Civic Center site that we're on right now. Will be constructed in the parking lot. Construction due to begin in the third quarter of this year. So the building that you're looking at here has two entrances, one for the police station, here shown with the mouse right there, and this is the entrance for the Village Hall and the District 58 portion of the building over here. And people would actually come into this entrance, or there's also an entrance on the other side of the building that would take them to a lobby that connects east side to west side. And the council chambers would be located right here. So entrance into the building and then into the chambers. Just thought that orientation would be helpful. I'd now like to introduce the design team that will be assisting me with the presentation and discussion this evening. We have David Yandel, principal with FGM Architects and design team project manager. Reagan Porter, who is the principal with FGM Architects as well and a interior design lead for the project. Also with FGM, Anna Neller, an interior designer. Tim King, principal with Hitchcock Design and the landscape architect. And Christopher Wong, principal with Selbert Perkins Design, design consultant focused on signage, graphics, and wayfinding. So we're excited to have this group here to provide brief presentations, but really to hear from the council to make sure the design of these spaces sort of meets the needs of the council and the community. I'm going to start out providing a few introductory comments and then turn it over to the design team members for more focused presentation on some of the specific topics. So what we're seeking council input on this evening, more specifically, is the council chamber's functional design. So you'll see some floor plans, you'll see some options, but ultimately what we like is comments that help guide us on the functional design of the council chambers. And specifically, the question of should the dais for the council sits on, be a movable dais that can be moved out of the space when it's not needed and put together when it is, or should it be a fixed, and typically they're fixed and raised dais, obviously where the council's sitting right now, are one of the key questions that we're looking for guidance on. The second area that we're seeking input on is the plaza and the landscaping design and visual features that will be incorporated into the plaza. So you'll see some examples and illustrations in the presentation materials, and we're looking for input in that area as well. A couple other key attributes of the overall plan, and these were included way back in the long-range plan documents as we were having some of the initial conversations back during the last summer in preparation for the facility replacement sustainability plan. But we talked about important attributes that have really guided the approach to design of the entire building. Efficient use of facilities, making sure that the facilities are used in a way that makes productive use of the space and does so now and well into the future. And that goes hand in hand with point number 2, creating flexible workspaces, not just individual workspaces for employees, but also spaces where the council and the community get their work done as well, and having flexibility to be able to adapt and meet the needs of a variety of different users and also adjust and adapt to future unforeseen circumstances. The ability to right-size the buildings, again, emphasizing that point of adaptability. And then seeking partnerships, which has also been a key component of this project all along, and really emphasized in the partnership that we have with District 58 that'll be joining us in this facility as well, and actively using the space that we're talking about designing. So just to give you an idea about how that space will be used, which is quite a bit different than how the Chambers is used in this building right now. You can see a list here on the board. Obviously, council meetings. District 58 will hold their board meetings in the space. We'll welcome the Park District back as well into that space, provided that's an interest of theirs. But in addition, there'll also be some new uses for the space, including District 58 teacher training, where they'll bring up to 40 teachers into the space on a regular basis to provide training activities. Village and police staff and interagency training. The room will give us a lot more flexibility to bring in groups of our employees, but also employees from other organizations to participate in training in the Chambers. Board and commission meetings will take place there as well, and of course, community meetings and gatherings in the spaces. So we envision it being a much more active space than how this space is used, especially during the daytime. So it's with that I'm going to go back to the start of the presentation and turn things over now to David and Reagan to talk a little more specifically about the council chambers design and really frame up the discussion and input that we're seeking from the Village Council.
Thank you, Mike. Speaking for the design team, we're thrilled to be here to continue this conversation. Again, we're looking for comments and feedback. Obviously, there's certain directions that we're heading, but there's certain variables that we want to make sure we get clear direction on, or as much direction as we can, as we continue to work closely with staff to progress the design. And so with that, one of them, as we mentioned, is council chambers, something that Anna and Reagan have been studying quite thoroughly over the last 2 months. And so we wanted to kind of see if we can start to nail things down as we head towards the design development phase of this project.
Good evening. Thank you for having us. Okay, what I'm going to do is just walk us through the different options, and then hopefully I can answer any questions that you may have. This first option is really the most flexible option that we could come up with. So, as you see here, the council set up as, chamber meeting would be everybody sitting at mobile tables up the front, and then staff would be seated over to the side here. I think one thing that's important in mentioning in this option is that these tables really can have a multitude of different design aesthetics to them. So don't think of your typical just flip-top table. We can do a full modesty like you have here at your current dais, where it goes to the floor so that nobody can see your legs or anything that may be underneath there. This option also has here the podium just like you have here. And then in terms of seating back here, currently we're showing about 110 seats comfortably in the back there. The other thing that you'll notice is with this option, another layout, you'll see a movable partition here on the west, or towards the west side of the council chambers. So you could subdivide it, where on the left-hand side you would have roughly seating for 24 people for a larger meeting. And then there could be another training session going on over on this side that would seat 56 people. So that's getting quite a bit still, on the right-hand side, seated for, a training session. So then we come to option 2, and this is more of a similar configuration to what you have now in terms of this area here being a raised dais, getting, everybody at the top here, and then staff being seated over here. We have the podium, And then this is just another layout. Again, you've got the 110 back here, and then you have an additional, if you wanted, you could do this in either option. You've got an additional 10 up front seated here. So it's just another option. What you'll notice in this option is because the room with the raised dais becomes a little less flexible, we had to move the movable partition to the east side of the room. However, you could then get still your 24 seated in a comfortable setting in the east side of the room. A couple other things to mention about this. So for ADA, we still have to have a ramp to get up and down. So in this option, you'll see that we ramp back here in the storage. And then you could have a step down here or a step down over here as well. Currently, we're showing about 6 inches up. Right now, you're sitting, just for reference, you're sitting at probably about, I would say, 14 inches up, 2 steps. So just, those are two kind of quick explanations of both the layouts. Do you have anything you want to add before I?
Just the other thought would be that with the fixed dais, it could also be on a flat plane. So it could still be at that lower level. And, there could potentially be a hybrid of a semi-fixed where it's not easily movable tables, but if you wanted to remove the dais for any certain reason, maybe there is that opportunity to pick it up and, it's more post-mounted or like kind of semi-fixed, rigid, but ultimately movable.
Yes.
So kind of that hybrid scenario. So this kind of showed 2 ends of the spectrum between a fully flexible space and something with a fixed piece of furniture kind of headlining one end of the building.
Go ahead and show the picture.
The picture? Okay. This is just the start of a design concept that we started. What you'll notice for this option is, so if the movable partition was here, we started to give it, we've got to have somewhere to anchor it up in the ceiling, so we started to wrap it in a wood, and then you'll notice the center double doors again gets wrapped to really give presence to that main entrance, and then kind of mirroring it for symmetry in the back half with kind of that wood wrapping around as well. In the front, taking cues from the exterior stone and maybe doing some sort of stone look-alike in some sort of tile on the, behind the dais. So it's just the start of how it could look.
So we'd really be looking for any council comments, feedback, input. Again, really focused heavily on this question of the functional design of the chambers.
You've seen a couple of meetings, you've seen how we do this. It's not perfect, but we'll just kind of let everybody kick this around a little bit, and you'll get their thoughts and reactions to it.
Yep.
So I don't forget, Chris, you want to give us your thoughts and comments on what you've seen so far?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So thank you for presenting this in such a clear way. It looks like we're looking at we're sort of flex versus fixed. My initial thought to it is just sight lines. So when I look at the rendering that you show with the different materials, the last photo that we just looked at, I am concerned that a non-raised dais, if you will, would be difficult for folks in the back to see. Right now, in our current chambers, we have the luxury of both a raised dais and stadium-style seating, so sight lines are fairly straight forward. So that would be my only concern. I'm a little torn. I like the idea of flexibility for this room for all the reasons that were listed in terms of the various uses outside of council and different types of meetings. But I think, what struck me first is just that sightline concern for people who are in attendance or even for those on the dais for their sightlines out to the audience. So that's my feedback. I think I'd be interested to hear what others have to say in terms of what they value from their standpoints.
Thanks, Chris. Greg?
Thank you, Mayor. Despite my private joking about informal things like smoke machines and lasers, in this particular instance, I trend a little more formal. I appreciate Commissioner Gilmartin's comments about sightlines. I agree with that. And I do like, in theory, the concept of flexibility, but there's a level of formality that I don't want to sacrifice. When you look at the items that the chamber will be used for, it's council meetings, District 58 meetings, Park District meetings, boards and commissions. There's 4 out of the 7. And I think there needs to be a sense of formality. This is primarily a seat of government. And I think the design needs to reflect that. So I'm looking for something a little less, sort of conference room like, and a little more courtroom like, I suppose. But I would like to see the seal of the Village of Downers Grove. I would like to see the ability to put up perhaps the Park District or District 58, things like that. I want you to walk in and know that this is a place where legislation is considered and passed. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Rich?
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues' comments. I've sat out there for one more year than I've sat up here, so it's important that we can be seen. And also, it's important that the seats out there are comfortable, because with a controversial subject, Plan Commission meetings can go to 11 o'clock at night. Occasionally our meetings go that long, so I think that's an important consideration. There's some security considerations about the dais that are probably important to retain moving forward. And so I think that's another reason that I'd like to go more towards the fixed dais as opposed to more of a community room type feeling to it.
Leslie?
Yes. What's funny is that I'm kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum as Commissioner Jose in my gut reaction, where I would like to make our government as approachable as possible. And so while I respect the level of formality, and I would hope that, like you said, we would be able to go to the floor and be able to put our, the Village of Downers Grove seal there. But I agree with Commissioner Gilmartin and Commissioner Colaveni that sightlines are a concern for me. I have been to plenty of meetings where it can be incredibly difficult to see the speakers, and that can make it much harder to feel like you're engaged. So while in my head I would love to try to make it a little bit less intimidating for folks to come and approach us, I think they also need to be able to see us and engage with us that way. So for that reason, I would also prefer the fixed dais and make sure it's a little bit raised, just so that everybody can see one another and connect that way.
Cool.
I'm going to echo most of what my colleagues said. My initial thought was, being so high, I also believe makes us less approachable. And I don't necessarily know that I want to feel like a courtroom when we have people from the community who are already anxious about speaking before us, coming to address us. However, I think my concerns were addressed when you stated that we're about 14 inches up now, you believe, and we would be, 6?
Correct.
So I still think that allows us to be able to be high enough that we can see everybody, low enough that we seem a little bit more approachable because we're not so high up. So for that reason, I feel like the fixed dais would be a good idea moving forward. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Danny?
Yeah, I agree. I also am in favor of the raised dais, not just for the sight lines and the formality like Commissioner Jose mentioned, but you mentioned it's also going to be used for all these other organizations too, and for trainings for teachers and police and staff, and I think that having the raised dais could help out with those organizations as well, with sightlines and their training procedures. The one question I did have, so you mentioned the 6-inch, is that because the ceilings are lower, or?
No, so with the 6 inches high, right, we need a 6-foot-long ramp. So it's really needing that, finding that balance between the amount of space for the ramp and it's to balance it all. And really the 6 foot is kind of that sweet, or 6 inches with the 6-foot ramp is really kind of that sweet spot.
Is it also why, it seems like a little uncentered, is that on purpose, obviously?
Yeah, so our thought is because we have storm shelters on either side. Oh.
You're just making it happen.
Okay, so we have storm shelters on either side, and we have to have rated doors to those storm shelters. And so you have double doors going in on either side, and really to balance that out, because we can't get those rated doors really in wood. They'd have to be some sort of metal. So we're really trying to make those blend into the back to really, even though there's symmetry within the space, there's a piece that then kind of recenters it almost in the perspective with that stone coming down.
Yeah. It does. This is obviously not the final design.
Right.
We've drawn ad nauseum versions of this and kind of narrowed it down to these two to show you today, to kind of show the flexible versus kind of a fixed option to get this kind of feedback. So it's certainly looking at the height, trying to keep it to a single riser, which could be no more than 7.5 by code, would be ideal. But working within that 6 inch to 7.5 inch dimension would be our primary goal. That way, limiting to kind of one step and a ramp that we can probably fit within the space. And then where that dais fits within kind of that north-south direction, centered within that wall, working around the clearances with the doors that come in and out of the space as well. Jumping around a little bit, sorry, with the divisional, or the dividing partition, that adds some complexity in terms of how big those rooms are and how many doors are necessary to egress from those individual spaces if that wall is closed. So once we kind of land on the dais solution, that's got potential some dominoes to tip in terms of what that north wall of the space and where the total layout changes. A couple things just about the sight lines real quick. We understand that the size and shape of the room is different than what we're in now. Obviously the tall dais and the tiered seating is great. This room, while not perfectly square, is approximately 49 feet by 49 feet, 50 feet square. The new building, or the new space, is a slightly different geometry, again, to try to get that flexibility. So it's about, 30 feet wide by 65 feet deep. So about the same area, but just different proportions. And again, that was driven a little bit by the goal to get 2 meeting rooms of 2 different sizes, as well as maintaining this formality of a council space. And so with sight lines, what we're trying to do, and is you can kind of see in this image as well, is additional monitors that would potentially be integrated into the space for those who may be sitting in the back on an overcrowded event. Certainly we've been in a few of these meetings where we've got plenty of seats. So trying to find that right AV layer on top of the design layer is one of the next steps as well.
That's where I was going, so.
Yeah. Well, this is a team. Yeah.
As I look at this thing, I don't want to, we're only going to do this once, right, guys? So, pardon my being maybe more blunt than I should be. That looks kind of like a disaster to me. I'm picturing this space, if you got 110 seats, I'm picturing this space with about 135 people, every one of them mad as hell, and wanting to have their opportunity to speak. and I'm looking at how people would get in and out of their rows and queue up and see us, and how we would see them. And that depth, that 65 versus 50, 15 feet's a long ways. It's a lot more depth. That takes those folks and puts them a lot farther away from us. The idea of a flat floor, is there any, I assume we got ADA issues installing stairs on purpose, but is there any way to get an elevation change from the front to back in the seating? Multiple rows. That 30 feet almost negates the opportunity, I would think, for a center aisle, which forces people into a tough spot. Because the other thing that happens, I know this is a little funny, but it's like going to a wedding. Depends on bride or groom which side of the aisle you sit on. Well, that's reality. The reality is we get 35 or 40 people out here, and 17 of them feel one way and 17 of them feel another, and they kind of like the idea they get to sit opposite each other. And so there's just some logistics that when I see a room like that, I think it's likely to add to relatively low ceiling, forcing people together, and making them queue up in a way that is tough for them to move around. It's likely to add to rather than detract from. The truth is, you mentioned that oftentimes we have these meetings and there's nobody here. That's right, because nobody comes to say, great job, guys. They show up when they're mad, right? And so they're already here. The reason they're here is because they're unhappy about stuff. That's just kind of reality. I was thinking back, the first time I was in this room, anybody want to guess?
1955.
Good guess. I was in here in 1985, and in 1985 I lived in Clarendon Hills, so why was I in this room? I was in court. I was in traffic court in 1985 in this room. And I appreciate the idea, and certainly I think we've all tried to create an environment that is approachable, but I think there is a value to formality when it is the seat of 5 or 6 governments. And so the flexibility is something that I think I completely concur with Greg. I'd sacrifice nearly all of it for accessibility, for some separation and some space for people that we know are frustrated and on the edge, and a certain degree of formality so that there's expectations set about how those go. We've seen too many meetings, in the news and other places that look in rooms just like this that look pretty chaotic to me. And some of that is the people, and some of that is the way the meetings run, to be sure, but I think some of it also is the space. When you're designing spaces, you're trying to create certain emotions, certain vibes, certain expected actions. Well, this is packing a lot of people in a tough spot, making them climb over each other when they're mad, and that makes me very nervous. The idea of a fixed dais that's raised, I think, is a good one, but added formality and space, if there was a way to get some of that in there. The sight lines is an issue. If you're in the last row of this thing and you're mad, and we're 65 feet away and you can barely see us, you're madder by the minute. That's kind of reality, and I'm worried about that. The AV stuff, I assume we're going to have various speakers and monitors as many places as we can that make sense, but it isn't going to make you feel better when you're sitting in the back row and you're mad. So I don't know if that helps or hurts, and it's not totally consistent with my colleagues, but it's certainly my opinion on it. Want to continue?
Please. Well, thank you for the feedback. It's incredibly helpful. It certainly will all be incorporated into the next steps of the design process. So thank you all for those comments. One thing I will say, obviously, this conversation was about the functional layout of the space and the room. Certainly, as the design process moves forward, we will make sure that honoring former Mayor Cheever is part of design choices that are made not only in the chambers, also in the lobby as well as people come into that space. So that will continue.
And one more comment. Could the floor be sloped as opposed to stepped up? It occurred to me that the Tivoli Theater is sloped. There's no steps as people go down, up or down into the auditorium. But they still have the way of having the seats in back quite a higher elevation than the seats all the way in front.
We'll take a look at that idea with the design team.
Anyone else want to interrupt anybody? I do have a couple more things I want to mention. So going back to the examples that were emailed around, so I assume you guys saw those, right?
Yes.
So none of those got my attention in a positive way, except for one thing. That first Beaverton one, the shape of the dais. One of the things that I've felt in my time up here has been a challenge is the lack of sort of completeness of this arc. So you sort of have to lean forward to talk to Rich. And so if we're talking about fixed dais, a little bit more complete of an arc where it's I don't know what it works out to, but a couple hundred degrees for all of us to be able to sort of be talking to each other as opposed to just at the audience. That I thought there was some appeal there in that layout to me. The other thing on this that I really, I'm going to just underscore one more time because it shows up differently on these two drawings. On the flexible layout one, as compared to the fixed dais, just the plan, the rough plan views that we had at the beginning. This idea of queuing up the audience, it doesn't happen all the time, but it needs to be easy and obvious where that's supposed to happen and kind of out of each other's way. So when I look at this, I think of, well, you could, I think we're talking about the north wall. You could sort of, in the fixed dais version, people could queue up on the north wall, approach that center podium and speak. If we were in a position sort of like the round table version, that would be pretty tough to do. So that both in the dais configuration of the movable one and the fixed one, think about that queuing. That's really important to maintain. So people get lined up here and you need to stay friendly with each other. And then the last thing I had on my list was this idea, Greg mentioned the ceiling height, or maybe it was Danny was asking about the ceiling height. I don't know what we're talking about here in ceiling height, but the taller the better, for all the reasons that I mentioned. A little airspace and a little bit of feeling of something opposite of claustrophobic. It's going to be helpful to us.
Yes, just on that note real quick, the rendering probably doesn't show it because we didn't drop a person in there, but the reason that this space is at the front of the building outside of its very obvious strong presence at the front of the building and off of the lobby is so that we could kind of get a double height, not double height, but like a story and a half tall. Ceiling height's tracking at 13 feet.
13, 14 feet right now.
Awesome. When I was looking into some examples around us, I noticed, I think it was Glenview that did a rehab, essentially, and one of the things they did was remove the false ceiling. And when you look at the before and the after, there's a way different feeling there.
It is. The volume helps with acoustics. Like you said, it gives the room a little bit more breathing space. There's a lot of positives that come out of that.
Cool. Well, this is why we're here. Anybody else? All right, you might want to continue down the road
I
here.
will. Yes, let's move ahead. We will now, get this back here, move on to the exterior plaza, or formerly known as the Blackburn Civil Rights Plaza. And I'm going to turn it over to Tim King, the landscape architect, to begin the conversation.
Great, thank you, Mike. So, real briefly here, I'll just touch on the overall landscape plan for the site. We're currently working with staff to make sure that we're addressing all the village code requirements for perimeter yards and all those different components and issues. So that we're working through. Those things are, there are specific requirements we need to meet. We're going to make sure we meet those, and we've adjusted the site plan to make sure we can achieve those requirements. The plaza itself is a little bit different story, where we don't really have certain code requirements that we need to meet with this space. More so, just the way that the design of the building is, it creates this really nice entrance space that we can work with. So some of the parameters that we're working with here, which are real components that we need to deal with. Let's see if I can point these out here. So the way the site works, the way the site works, this corner is the low point. So all the parking lot slopes down in both directions here, and so this point is about 6 feet lower than this plaza space up here. So these lines that you see in here are a series of retaining walls that show up in the illustrations that we'll point out a little bit more. But we need to transition that grade down so we make sure that we have ADA accessible walkways to the building entrances and through the space. So the police entrance is on the north side, and the Village Hall, as Mike had pointed out before, is on the west side, and so we need to make sure we're providing clear access to those points. The darker brown material there is what we're pointing out as a potential for a plaza-type space. We have flexibility on how much space we provide there, but then you can see that there's also a good amount of landscape in that space as well. We want to make sure we're providing trees for shade. If people are going to be out in that space, that's something that's important, that we make sure we have some comfortable spaces. And then we also we're starting to represent some furnishings in there. But generally speaking, our design team hasn't gotten into those details quite yet. As the site plan develops, we'll start to get into that. And tonight we just wanted to get some feedback on what do we want to occur in this space? How much space do we think is necessary for public gathering? And we'll start to develop ideas from there. So this is the image that we had shown earlier on, but you can see those white lines are those retaining walls. I will point out in this graphic that the grading isn't quite right on the parking lot. It looks like it drops a little more significantly than it really will. We're working with the engineers to work through all that. But it is, we're trying to keep that plaza space relatively level. These views, it maybe shows up a little more clearly, in particular this view here. So you can see how there'll be a walkway that goes right towards the Village Hall entry, and then there'll be another walkway that goes towards the police entry, and we'll transition that grade through this space. So it's a little small on the screen, but you can start to see the amount of space we're talking about here, where there's a handful of potentially tables, or these components on the edge are seat walls, which will help to define the space. But we're trying to create a space that feels comfortable, where people can gather there, but it doesn't feel like it's a big wide open plaza space that's empty on a day that people are just circulating in and out of the building. Materials, we're taking cues from the building architecture, so the paving materials, the walls and things will very much play into the style of the building. And landscape material, the input we've gotten so far is we're very much going to cue from naturalized type planting design rather than more garden type planting design, and really pushing that sustainable end of things as well. So that's a very brief overview of the space. And again, we're going to keep developing this with the design team as the site plan develops, and I'm sure we'll have more options for the specifics of the components within the space. But if there's any input that you want to give on the space itself, we'd be happy to hear that.
Anyone want to jump in? Leslie?
Happy to jump on this one. I do appreciate the thought towards, the naturalized plantings, especially if we're going to have kind of those different elevations in some areas that might take in a little bit more water than others. It could be a really nice way to showcase ways in which people could have native plantings in their own yards. So I love the idea of that. One thing that may or may not get me in trouble up here, we'll find out, is, man, would I love this to be able to be a place where we could have something like potentially public art or fine arts. If this is going to be, a plaza that's celebrating the history of civil rights, then I think it should also be a place where we get to celebrate our different cultures and diversity, change makers in the village. It could just be a really wonderful opportunity to bring people together in that way. And I think that public art is a wonderful way to do that. So I don't know if it's possible or if there are spaces where perhaps we could partner with some non-governmental organizations to make that happen. I would love to be able to see that again, to make this plaza more than just a name and make it something that's actually meaningful to the community in that way would be great to see. So those are my thoughts.
If I could interrupt just very quickly. So we've got a two-part conversation here. So we've kind of set the stage with Tim, and this is a very collaborative process between the design team for kind of the building and the project as a whole, Tim from a landscape standpoint, and then Chris and his team, who's kind of our, we're going to interweave this kind of graphics and wayfinding. And so we're on you. And so once we kind of hear this general plaza conversation, it'll set up Chris nicely to kind of come back and talk about some of the ideas that we're working with staff on in terms of addressing that specific point list.
Anyone else? Mr. Gilmartin, you want to weigh in here?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So one of the questions I have, and thank you for the drawings and the rendering, really helpful to see it in 3D and visual. One of the questions I have is part of the intention of some of this design to allow for a space for public gathering? And I don't just mean like at a table here and there, but like where a group could meet for an outdoor talk or that type of thing. Like, is that part of what was considered in this, given who and what we may be calling this plaza?
So the initial conversations we've had were to create a space that was flexible and right-sized for the space. So there's, again, that's somewhat subjective. How big should the plaza space be in relationship to the planting? So we're still working through that. But I think the answer to the question is we want this to be a spot where people can gather, yet at the same time, I don't think people really envision it as being just a wide open, flat, paved space that feels empty on a day-to-day basis. So it's finding that balance.
Okay, great, thanks. I think it's, for me, I think given sort of the motivation to use this space and use this space as a way to honor one of our founding fathers, I think the opportunity to create a space that could be gathering would be great, and continue. The seat walls look great. And I would just also suggest we think about, and this is probably further down, but just any sort of electric needs or things like that could host some sort of outside thing, or even like lighting that may make that a more functional space for whatever activities we may see fit there, as outdoor space seems to be more and more desirable for those in town.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Rich?
Yeah, I do like the idea of native plantings, and when thinking about this, we think we have some opportunity for taller plants further out and shorter as we get closer to the building to not make a barrier to entry. My next comments might run counter to Commissioner Gilmartin in that I'm not sure people will hang out here. Now, it could be a catch-22 or which comes first kind of thing, but typically the only reason people hang out here is when they're even madder at us when they leave, and they want to have a place where they can sit and complain about us and the things we either said or didn't say, or things we voted on that didn't go their way. And so I'm not sure how to best facilitate that. Having 4 people at a table is probably not going to be the best way. And I don't know if I'm articulating that properly, or if anyone else understands what I'm saying, but that's okay too, I guess.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this? Greg?
Thank you, Mayor. You're right, 4 people at a table might not be the right way to do it, but hey, I'm open to ideas. The key point for me is I think I envision this as being a place where people can gather, whether it's 4 or 24 or 120. Well, hopefully we don't get that many protesters, but I was going to say 124. But I do see it as a place where you could have, a demonstration, where you could have a vigil, where you could have, something of that nature, where folks might decide to, rather than come and speak at the podium, find another way to send a message to us. And it hopefully will be more celebratory than anything else. But I like the idea of having that spot to gather, something other than a parking lot. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Nicole?
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with most of what a few of my colleagues said in terms of leaving this for a larger gathering spot, but I do hope that we consider some flexibility with the space. I wouldn't like to see it empty all the time. I would hope that we could do some tables where people could sit. I know we've got a few near the train station, which are utilized all the time, particularly in the summer when people are out and about and walking around downtown, and maybe they're just getting ice cream, or then they're strolling around and they're looking for a place to sit down, or they've got a kid that needs to tie their shoe and they need a place to sit. So I like the idea of a larger gathering in this space, but I don't want to leave it so open that we lose some of the opportunity for people to simply be in that space. That's all, Mayor.
Thank you.
Well, I think the train station is a good example of that. And I don't know if it's the fountain that draws people there or the proximity to Main Street, or let's meet at the fountain and then, we'll go for ice cream or we'll go wherever. And then also what happens is you have bands that play there on a regular basis. Farmers Market is there on Saturday mornings, which is another reason for people to be there. So I like some of those ideas. I'm just not sure how much of that we'd be able to draw here, particularly when there's a big building between this gathering point and downtown. But I guess if we leave the place flexible enough.
Right. I think even just a few would be nice. We don't need to fill it, but I also don't want it empty, if that makes sense. If there's a good balance, I think that would be nice. Maybe some people will say, let's gather near this beautiful new village hall.
There you have it. Free hot dog day.
Danny, you got any thoughts on this?
No, I concur. I think it's I agree that I'd like to see it as a gathering place, and similar to what Commissioner Colavani said, I think people really gravitate towards the Main Street fountain. If we had something like that here, not a fountain per se, but where people could come and take pictures, and maybe this could be the new face of what you pull up on Google when you search Downers Grove. So I'd like to see it be a gathering place for people to come and hopefully have a good time and not protest, but yeah.
Celebrate.
Yeah. That's it.
I think you're hearing the same message. I had mentioned that earlier when I was talking about the naming, that I wanted it to be a place for the public to voice, debate, celebrate, demand, change. When I was thinking about tonight, I also added a place to just be. I think Commissioner Wallace mentioned that too. So it's a little bit of a trick. That's why you guys are on the payroll. But a place to be, so that it doesn't feel like an empty barn. We don't want this to be a mall parking lot when people aren't in it. But at the same time, accommodating is a place to gather and a place for the community to rally, positive, negatively, whatever. It needs to be a space that accommodates that too. So some flexibility there is, what a nonsense term to try and tell you, flexibility. But these are the things that are in all of our heads. You've heard it now 7 times in one way, shape, or form. A place where people can just be, and at the same time turn around and make it a gathering place. I think are really important to all of us. So it's got to be something that ends up feeling pretty good, and it is our front door. There's that aspect of it too. We talked about plantings, and everybody is on the same page with that. I'd like to add that site-wise, beyond the plaza, if we could not have to mow a blade of grass, that would be a really good thing in my mind. I can't speak for everybody up here, but when you think about the comments that have been made over the past 4 to 6 months about environmental efforts and the things we're trying to work on in terms of demonstrating with our building and setting the right message for people, you can create quite an environment, as you well know, without mowing anything. So beyond just the plaza, the amount of that we can minimize, the better, for a host of reasons, not the least of which is we're trying to set an example here. So I'd like to underscore that. I know we can do a good job without having to prune grass. The other stuff that we've talked about, and you guys have given us some slides a little later on, I assume that's going to be a little different conversation that maybe you guys want to lead or start, or we talked about some things as it relates to, in particular, to Blackburn and the naming and the process of trying to incorporate that.
Yeah, I think that's a good opportunity to turn it over to Chris.
It's almost like a
Wrap
perfect
up.
segue. The comments that you shared, which we, we likewise share. This is a gathering space in that front door and an opportunity to celebrate individuals within the village are some of the messages that we've been hearing. And so kind of Chris and his team's role is that kind of extra layer and help bring that vision, to fruition for what this plaza might be as it celebrates, Israel Blackburn, much like he's going to help us with the vision for Betty Cheever inside the building. So this is a kind of an introduction to that topic, when we're likewise looking for a little bit of feedback so we can maybe try to narrow a direction or two on how we continue to work with village staff in terms of roughing out some design concepts.
Great, thanks, Dave. Thank you. So you've heard a lot from both design teams, and we're working really closely with them as well as we'll be with staff. But I think before I dive into sort of the two big buckets of our approach into content, I think really context is key, right? When you go to a place, you arrive at this space and you learn so much about it, but then you start to discover things that you may or may not know beforehand. And we want this place to be welcoming, inviting, but you also, considering the programs of what might happen within the building as well as outside. We consider, people of all ages, as you mentioned, about kids tying their shoelaces. And then I think of the little wolf out here. Or I mean, that to me is a place-making, storytelling element. And I think that ties back to your comment, Commissioner, about, art and public art. And so when you have a moment like that, and then it becomes a teaching moment to kids, a storytelling moment to friends, and then all of a sudden this sort of blank space has a lot more richness in narrative, celebrating the things that we want to celebrate and highlighting the things that we want to highlight. So having said that, our team had dove into this, started our initial research, and I think we will continue to do more of that. But we have taken kind of two broad paths and broad strokes into how we want to celebrate Mr. Blackburn's his legacy. One way we thought was a real sort of linear way, sort of a timeline way. In terms of content, the way that we would curate the content is sort of his early life and then his life in Downers Grove. There are moments in there that we can highlight and teach and pull out and start to celebrate and narrate. And that's, we could sprinkle it throughout the plaza. And in fact, I know our task, our effort is to look at this plaza and celebrate Mr. Blackburn. But could we, as we look at the entire site, how does the underlying story that we want to celebrate about community and people, how does that start to spill out? And so it becomes almost like a breadcrumb. But I know tonight we're focused on this, so let me get back to the point. We can also look at the plan in what Tim has done in providing us a context, whether it's plantings, whether it's pavement walls or seat walls and things like that. How do we then layer in storytelling? So one way, as I was saying before with the diagram before, is to do sort of a timeline sequence of events. Could we divide the plaza in half or maybe in quadrants and start to narrate his story, his life story from an early life perspective to Downers Grove? Maybe it's from west to east as opposed to east to west. And how does it then connect to the corridor and the pathways? we want to consider, how people engage the space, the commuters from the train station, the local community members that might come up, park, and then walk the pathways. How will they engage the space and what will they see? And then after they're done with their activities in there, what will they do? Will they sit and find and discover? There are many, many ways that we can start to layer that into the landscape, the hardscape, signage, things that could be really traditional, things that could be more integrated as opposed to just kind of, here's a sign that we slapped on, here. We want to make sure that it's done in a sophisticated manner so that it really honors the story that we want to tell. So this first approach really is kind of more of a timeline approach. And then there's a second approach that as we kicked around in our team, that we thought was really timeless in a way. We thought of the things that we learned about him and what made him successful, and we started to pull out these keywords and kind of spitball on it. It's these things that we know that the hardworking aspect, the bravery just from learning of what he has gone through, what he's done, optimism, and just being entrepreneurial and learning about his vegetable, selling stand and things like that. So we said, all right, so there are kind of 3 story buckets that we can pull out. Is there a social impact story that we can start to tell? Is there a national impact and then a local impact? What does that want to do to the story that we want to tell about him and Downers Grove? And what are these timeless character traits and aspects that anyone can identify with? Hey, I'm a visionary. I want to be a visionary, and I can have these big ideas, and nothing's going to stop me. Those things that will resonate inherently with any one of us, kids, young, old. So we thought that was really a more. Well, I don't want to lead the witness. I think it has a lot of potential because you're not trying to fit a story within a timeline and physically within the space. It's almost like, you could kind of discover as you go along the way, and find all these qualities as you navigate the space, right? So in looking at that plan, we could, again, dissect them into quadrants, or we can shuffle the deck. We could go and say, all right, maybe in north, south, east, west quadrant, we can always have a social, national, and local impact kind of in a cluster, in each. Or do we just, segment them into kind of the 3 or 4 quadrants? I think all of that is up for discussion and exploration. I think we'll find the best way to tell the best story that's digestible for young and old. And having said that, I think there are many ways that we can do this. What Tim is trying to do, we can look at integrating graphics into the seat benches, things that are kind of hidden, and then it becomes almost like a treasure hunt, if you will. Hey, did you see that little quote on the side? Did you see that nugget? And going back to the public art comment, we've done many projects where we try to uncover, history and side stories, where we pull out an element. We did a project at MIT where we celebrated, a thread factory that used to be there. So we had a sculpture of a thread spool. Is there something like that we can do that celebrates Mr. Blackburn's history and story? It could be dimensional, it could be sculptural, or it could be interpretive, where you have kind of like the top left image. You could have a vignette, and then you have a write-up for people to learn more. And that format, you could do it in so many different ways. The top left is a little bit more contemporary. Could it be done more kind of honorific way in the top middle, or even just etched right into the bench? Could we look at hardscape furnishing along with Tim? Is it tree grades? And is there a story to tell about tree grades and its relationship to the site? Could we look at sunscreens and sunshades and cast a shadow or cast a pattern? So there are many playful ways that we can do that, and then certainly if you're along the pathway and as you journey through, could there be quotes that get etched or sandblasted into the concrete? Now, all of these things, we can work with the materials that would be specified, that we have, longevity, and there's a good way to service them. That's kind of what we've prepared for you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
And maybe we can just give some reactions to what we heard, try and, help give some next step likely direction. So, anybody want to? Did you start last time?
I did, but you know that this is the stuff that I get excited about.
Well, then start us off.
All right. I love the second idea of the character traits. I understand kind of why a lot of folks go towards timelines, because it is very linear and it means you can follow a path. But I think it's really important for especially this piece of history, and honestly even now, to recognize that all of those early things that happened in his life were still a part of who he was later. And sometimes when you have a timeline like that gets lost, that, all of these things, despite having had success in Downers Grove, which is wonderful, all of those, traumas and everything were still a part of that very rich and complex character of who he was and who really any of us are. And so I love the idea of exploring those character traits, and seeing how it is that people can kind of overcome some of these obstacles, the environment that was around them. And so literally, potentially building that environment around them that can help foster some of that. And so that we could be that community that could do that for people who, again, want to be the change makers of the community. I love, for the technical parts, I love the ideas of the graphics and benches. Like I was just explaining, I love the idea of just incorporating it into that surrounding environment. Again, it just kind of, to me, feels much more like that building of the community and we are a part of this larger thing rather than just, some name on a plaque. It's more than that. He was more than just that one person. He was part of that community at that time, and that's what I would like to build, whoever ends up sitting up here at any given moment. So I really like some of those elements that you've shown of incorporating into the materials there. So, and being the informal educator who has done some write-ups like that, we definitely see that nobody's going to stick around beyond about 30 to 60 seconds. So any of those write-ups that are too long, you're going to get, maybe some nerds like me who might sit there and look at it. But that's not going to be my husband who's going to kind of blaze by it. So having those small vignettes that are built into the environment are going to be a little bit more accessible for all. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Mr. Gilmartin, I keep looking to my left and seeing this big head on the screen.
It's a great photo, isn't it?
You know what it is? It's good. It helps me not forget you're out there. What are your thoughts?
Appreciate that, Mayor. So, I want to thank you for the thoughtful design elements that you put into this. I too think option 2 stood out to me for many of the reasons that Commissioner Sadowski you just mentioned. I think what I like about the sort of the quadrants or the different things here is I think initially it feels like a great representation of Israel Blackburn. I think there's a lot we can do there. But I could also see these spaces also representing other Downers Grove folks who have been kind of motivated or have been seen in the same light. So when we think about local impact and national impact, social impact, to me, those are things that I could absolutely see go beyond simply this initial design. One of the things that I personally prefer some of the more permanent looking ideas, like the quotes in the side of the bench. What I loved about the tree grate was it sort of reminded me of him being blacksmith, and I feel like tying that into that, or even the top middle photo of that looks sort of iron-based imagery. To me, that felt like there was a connection to him. I love the sunshade quotes. I don't know how you might incorporate that, given what the the plaza looks like, but to me, that's just such a creative way, and again, if it could be tied to some of that, his role and his profession. Less a fan of some of like the spiraling quotes kind of thing in the sidewalk, but understand, you're sort of giving a mood board rather than actual execution. So, but to me, too, definitely stands out. I think you captured a lot of what I think will allow us to honor the man, to portray his impact in many ways, but also allow us to extend that beyond. So really, really happy with both options, but I think option 2 really stood out to me. I think that's all the feedback I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Others? Rich?
Nicole? I could go with either option 1 or 2. I'm more linear in the way I think, so that timeline thing related to me. As far as what graphics we use, I happen to be a fan of these boulder plaques where you have a bronze plaque on a boulder, because they last a really long time and you can put a lot of words on them, tell the story. I do, but I would yield to the engraved seating type area. It's kind of a modern interpretation of that. And I like the center display, the storyboard, because I think it would attract people that are just walking by, or people walking in the town and say, oh, look, there's something to be read there. So I think, having that visibly available with, also there's a nice story. You can have the text on the left and the picture on the right, as long as it's, made out of good durable material that's not going to look faded and all that.
Don't we have a sign ordinance that requires those to be EFS?
No EFS. No EFS on this building, right?
Others? Nicole?
Thank you, Mayor. I tend to really, I just love this whole thing, so truly I appreciate both ideas. As a history major, I kind of like timelines are our thing. So I'm like, oh, I kind of like the timeline. So I don't know if there's a way we can incorporate just a little timeline somewhere. I know maybe not a whole lot of people might look at it. Otherwise, I really appreciate the more permanent things, as well as a couple of my colleagues have mentioned. The etching in the bench, the grading around the trees. I love the sunshade quotes. I think that's super unique, and I don't think I've seen that anywhere, before this evening. So I think that could be incredibly unique. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm option 2 all day long. Out of the options, or of the depictions here on the screen, the only thing I'm not crazy about is the sign. I like the permanence of the other elements, the creativity of them. And I think we can accomplish a lot of what's on the sign in other ways in other places. But let's tell his story, and let's do it in an interesting and creative way. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Danny?
Yeah, as far as the options, I could go either way on that. I don't have a strong opinion either way. I can go timeline or the quadrant. I tend to agree with Commissioner Jose. I really don't. I think the top left sign looks a little commercial to me. I really like the sunshades, as everyone else has mentioned. And going back to what Chris mentioned, maybe we could incorporate the electrical piece to it and have some lights shining on those at night. I think that would look really cool. But something more permanent, not as commercially looking, would be what I would be in favor of. That's all.
Thank you. I had a couple of things that you said that struck out. You mentioned the word discover a couple of times. And then I thought about that, and the other thing you said was breadcrumbs. And I think about my interaction with these kinds of locations, the idea of discovering things. It's kind of anti-timeline. You discover something here, and breadcrumbs draw you somewhere else. And the other thing that I think is kind of can be really interesting and really impactful about those things is you think you know, right? You read the first thing and you think you know, but then something, a breadcrumb of some kind, takes you somewhere else to a piece of discovery, and then you really become engaged, because all of a sudden you're like, well, wait a minute. So that general premise that we would not be a pure timeline of signs, that, I mean, everybody has said that same thing, but some of those breadcrumb discovery things, as we weave pieces of this in and out of the plaza, is something that I'd be really hopeful we'd be able to pull that together. The other thing I guess I wanted to mention is, from my perspective, we do want to focus on the namesake of the plaza, but part of what we're trying to do is celebrate and affirm civil rights here, and so I don't want to lose sight of that. I don't want it to only be about Israel Blackburn's, life. That certainly is important, but part of why it's important is a demonstration of the change that's required and the effort that's required and the impact it has on individual lives to really put civil rights first and foremost. So having that not be lost in the messaging is something that's important to me.
Got it. Thank you.
Anyone else want to circle back around? Think we're helping?
Absolutely. This has been extremely helpful. We will absolutely take what we've heard tonight, work with the design team to incorporate this input and improve what you see as the design goes forward.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Making the trip tonight, spending the time.
That ends the manager's report tonight, Mayor.
What a slacker. All right, we do have a little bit of meeting to wrap up. Thank you, Mike, for your work as well. Last item on our agenda prior to adjournment is council member reports. This is a portion of our meeting where council members report out on goings-on in the community, other entities or groups they're connected to or party of. We'll look left and start right. Rich, do you have anything for us tonight?
No report, Mayor. Thank you very much.
Leslie?
No report, Mayor. Thank you.
Nicole?
That was sneaky. No report, Mayor.
Wasn't
Thank
it?
you.
Wasn't it? Now I'm going to look at you and say, Commissioner Gilmartin.
I knew that was going to happen. As soon as you said it, and then you turned and looked at the camera. I just want to say thank you to staff for helping me get set up to be remote today. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys all in May. No report, thank you.
Danny?
No report. Thank you, Mayor.
Greg?
No report, Mayor. Thank you.
I have no report either, except Chris, best wishes. Glad you could join us tonight. Hope you're feeling well sooner rather than later.
Thank you.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you all and good night.
Slight delay.